We do live in tough times, and we know that. But you know, what an incredible future we have. One of the greatest things in life is to be able to make a difference in someone's life, to be a difference in that life. Nothing is more challenging, rewarding, rich, satisfying than that. And you know, you think about it, that's a way of exercising the giving way of life. You know, I've heard the phrase all my life since I was young, give versus get. Well, that's in living action. And it's an incredible activity and contribution. I know we realize at the beginning of the millennium, we're going to inherit the battered, bruised, and broken remnants of the nations. And we're going to begin to repopulate this planet with those broken remnants. And then after that 1,000 years, with the general resurrection of the masses of this age in the last great day, we're going to have an entire mass of people into billions and billions that are going to need a helping hand, an extremely helping hand. If we know anything about the 6,000 years of this world, its history, its breakage. And to be able to lend a helping hand, to be able to make a difference, to be able to be a difference, that's one of the greatest aspects of our incredible future. It's one of the prime things that's going to make it so incredible. But behind that helping hand that is extended is a mindset. There's a mindset that produces and promotes that helping hand that reaches out and that operates off of that mindset. And the two go together like cause and effect. The two go together like hand in glove. The mindset that extends a helping hand is going to be maximized in the world to come. But it's also a mindset that is desperately needed in this day and time now. And in fact, as we practice that mindset now, that's part of the preparation for the world tomorrow. So I want to deal with that mindset this afternoon. And I'm going to deal with it this way. In the winter of 1937, America was in the 7th year of the most catastrophic decade in its history. The economy had come crashing down. Millions upon millions of people had been torn loose from their jobs, their savings, their homes. A nation that drew its audacity from the American belief that success is open to anyone who is willing to work hard enough for it, was disillusioned by intractable poverty. The most brash of peoples were seized by despair, fatalism, and fear. People were in need of a hero, as they always seem to be in times like that, of a hero of proof that the little guy could make it, that the little nobodies had a chance if they were willing to work hard enough. They needed someone like them to make it big. There was a vacuum there. And into that vacuum and into that need in the winter of 1937 rode their hope. A small horse, seemingly from nowhere, began to take the thoroughbred racing world by storm. At the time, 2/3, 66% of the nation's homes had radios, and by the time his racing career was over, he had ridden into the homes and the hearts of America. He had blistering speed, and there was no quit in him. On November the 1st in 1938, in what is still widely regarded as the greatest horse race in history, he beat the East's top horse, War Admiral, by 4 lengths. Anybody who knows anything about horse racing knows what that means. War Admiral was the Triple Crown winner. You know, when a horse wins the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes and the Kentucky Derby, that is quite an achievement. In fact, you can go years between Triple Crown winners. War Admiral was the Triple Crown winner, but nobody had ever seen all that War Admiral could give because he had never raced a horse that could push him hard enough. In this race, he gave it all he had, but it wasn't enough. He could not get ahead of the other horse. War Admiral ran the greatest race of his life that day. In all of his races, he ran his greatest race that day, running by far his fastest time ever for that distance. but it wasn't good enough. But the small horse from nowhere ran into the history books that day. It was said this of him: no horse in Pimlico's fabled and lengthy history, through thousands of races dating back to just after the Civil War, had ever run the distance so fast. In that same year of 1938, think about history. In 1938, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Roosevelt. In that same year, with all of those subjects, the subject of the most newspaper column inches wasn't even a person. It was this undersized, crooked-legged horse, racehorse, with the unusual name of Seabiscuit. He would be named Horse of the Year in 1938. He would go on to win the racing's biggest money prize in 1940, the Santa Anita Handicap in California. And I would say this, if you haven't already done so, and I know many of you in here have seen the movie, and maybe some of you who haven't, it came out several years ago. But if you haven't seen it, see it sometime. But even better yet, a little promotion here, and giving a little credit too. If you like to read, get the book Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. A lot of the facts and information that I'm using comes from this book. It is absolutely quite a story. The story of Seabiscuit is a saga. And as a saga, it's packed with lesson after lesson after lesson. Seabiscuit came from good stock. He was sired by Hardtack. Hardtack was his father, and Hardtack had been sired by Man of War. Now again, if you know anything about racing, Man of War is considered, not was, but is. Of course, he's been long dead. But Man of War is considered the greatest racehorse that has ever lived. But whereas Man of War and Hardtack had all the beautiful lines of perfect symmetry of their pedigree, Seabiscuit didn't. His stunted build reflected none of the beauty and breadth of his forebears. Here's a description of him. It says, his body built low to the ground had all the properties of a cinder block. Where Hardtack had been tall, sleek, tapered, every line suggesting motion. His son was blunt, coarse, rectangular, stationary. He had a sad little tail, barely long enough to brush his hocks. His stubby legs were a study in unsound construction, with squarish, asymmetrical, baseball glove knees, and didn't quite straighten all the way, leaving him in a permanent semi-crouch. Thanks to his unfortunate assembly, his walk was an odd, straddle-legged motion that was often mistaken for lameness. He had what some horsemen called a egg-beater gait. In his career, people who saw him and didn't know if that's Seabiscuit, they sometimes mistook him for a cow pony or simply a milk truck delivery horse. There was not a single thing about him that would make somebody look at him and say, wow, there stands a winner. Yet, this ugly little horse with the unusual name would go on to capture the heart and the imagination of an entire nation. But just as amazing as this horse were the three men who were behind him. Without them, you and I would never have heard of Seabiscuit. He was just another lost cause. He was just another ruined creature. His potential had been buried away under wounds and bruises, not so much of the physical, but of the psyche, the mental, the emotional. Horses, for anybody who's ever been around horses, knows anything about them, horses are highly intelligent and social creatures, and they can be damaged quite easily if not handled properly. Seabiscuit had been badly mismanaged. For any racing purposes, he had been ruined. Thoroughbreds are born to run. They love to run. It's their potential. Well, that had been burned out of him. The top jockey of that time, the most famous jockey of that time, said of him that he was mean, restive, and ragged. But his basic nature, to start out with, had been one of gentleness. He didn't have the fiery temperament of his grandfather, Man of War, and his father, Hardtack. His two favorite pastimes were eating and sleeping. He became a horse that nobody really wanted, lost cause, broken horse, and then on a sultry August Sunday in Detroit. In 1936, three men formed an alliance, recognizing the talent that was dormant in the horse and also in each other. And they began the rehabilitation of Seabiscuit that would lift him and them from obscurity. These three men were the owner who was purchasing him, C.S. Howard, the trainer, Silent Tom Smith, and their jockey, Red Johnny, or better known as Red Pollard. They saw something there they could work with. The trainer, Tom Smith, said 4 sentences to C.S. Howard. He said, quote, "Get me that horse. He has real stuff in him. I can improve him. I'm positive." Silent Tom didn't waste words. Silent Tom Smith knew there was something lying dormant. C.S. Howard later said, "I can't describe the feeling he gave me, but somehow I knew he had what it takes. Tom and I realized that we had our worries and troubles ahead. We had to rebuild him, both mentally and physically. But you don't have to rebuild the heart when it's already there, big as all outdoors." They had a broken horse to repair, a broken horse to fix, to restore. There was some healing that had to be done. And each of these men had some brokenness of their own in their own life to deal with. Maybe this was one reason they reached out to this horse and to each other. C.S. Howard had gone west with 21 cents in his pocket, and he had parlayed that into a fortune. But tragedy struck when his 15-year-old son, Frankie, was killed in a vehicle crash. He never fully recovered from Frankie's death. Of course, how does a parent ever fully recover from the death of a child? Many years later, a teenage job applicant asked Howard about a picture of Frankie that Howard kept in his office. The teenage applicant said, "Is that you in the picture?" And Howard responded, "Do you think it looks like me?" The applicant said yes, and when he looked up, tears were running down Howard's face. Losing a child is one of the hardest things that a person can ever deal with in this life. Howard had a concern and a compassion that came from a deep pain. And then, partly as a result of Frankie's death, his marriage collapsed. Silent Tom Smith was an aging cowboy. He had spent his life on the open ranges. It was a way of life to him. But that way of life had gone the way of the buffalo, so he found himself basically disenfranchised. He found himself basically a cowboy without a range. What had been home was no longer home. And like so many, he was displaced. He was a man without a place. He was a refugee from the vanishing frontier. But he knew horses. His whole life had been spent among horses. And he went where the horses were and always would be racing. There was a need for trainers, for those who really understood horses, could work with them, and he turned out to be one of the best. Silent Tom had a basic philosophy that he lived by, and it can be summed up in these words: you don't throw a life away just because it's banged up a little. He became known for being able to take ruined or broken down horses and restore them. He had a healing touch. He had a healing hand. This started with that healing philosophy, that mindset he had. His philosophy, his mindset drove his actions. His philosophy underpinned all he did. He approached each horse as a distinct individual, and he took time to study it and to get to know it. He believed with complete conviction that no animal was permanently ruined. Every horse could be improved. He lived by the maxim, learn your horse. Underneath all he did was that bottom line philosophy of his: you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. Red Pollard, the jockey, was abandoned by his guardian when he was 15. From that point on, he was on his own, he was alone and on his own, and the world of horses became his own. They filled a certain need, a certain vacuum in his life. Red developed and became known for a niche as a miracle worker for tough and neurotic horses. He seemed to have a very deep insight into them, to understand them. It was almost like a kinship, and, well, maybe it was. They had no place or future. if he couldn't reach them and work with them. Unless they could be healed, they had no future. Now, Red had a problem. Red had a problem that he kept to himself, because if it ever got out, he had no future. Not as a jockey. And there was no way to heal it. He was totally blind in his right eye. You know what that means as a jockey? It means you don't jockey. A blow on the head over his visual center had taken his sight in that eye. And if you looked at him, that eye looked normal, but no light printed from that eye on his brain. And he lived with that secret, knowing that if ever got out, he was finished. Did he carry a certain special personal empathy for the horses that were broken and needed help? He developed a special bond with Seabiscuit, and he knew how to get the best out of him. Nobody could ride him quite like Red, and that's saying something, because Red was kind of a giant of a jockey. He was 5'7", which was around the average height of a man at that time. And other jockeys used to kid him about, maybe you should carry the horse for a while. 3 men, each broken to some degree in his own way, each wounded by something in his own life, working with a broken and wounded horse to restore it, and through their efforts, slowly but surely, the horse was transformed. And they were helped too in the process. You know, the story of Seabiscuit, it's a story of healing. It's a story of rehabilitation. It's a story of restoring. It is a tremendously powerful physical example of such. In the annals of human history, there are a few classics. There are not a lot of them, but there are some classic stories, accounts, examples that bear out so much. And this is one of them. It's a story of hope and comeback. And it's primarily because of 3 men who wouldn't give up, who refused to quit. It was not in their vocabulary. They brought the horse to light, and then through him, they were brought to light. They put into practice that bottom line perspective: you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. See, when you take that philosophy, that's a keeper philosophy. That's a keeper attitude. That's a committal attitude. And it's only within that mentality that healing can take place. It's only within that attitude that one refuses to quit. And it's only within that attitude that opportunity will continue to be extended, that the helping hand will continue to be extended. It's only through continually extended opportunity that true healing will take place, because it's a slow process. And why is that specific philosophy, perspective so important for us? Brethren, and I include myself in this, how many of us who are here today and that are hearing my voice, how many of us would be here today if God and Jesus Christ didn't carry that philosophy and perspective toward us? I wouldn't be. And I'll just say you wouldn't be either. Because, you know, we've all banged up our lives to one degree or another. We're all banged up to one degree or another. I'm not going to turn there to Romans 3:23, but you'll recognize it when I just quoted Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But I would like for you to notice with me Psalm 103, beginning in verse 10. Psalm 103, beginning in verse 10. And yet, God has been very merciful to us. Psalm 103, beginning in verse 10, verses 10 through 14. God has been very merciful to us. He has a keeper attitude. It says here in the words of the psalmist, He has not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is His mercy toward them that fear Him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. Like as a father pities his children, so the Lord pities them that fear Him. For He knows our frame. He remembers we are dust. We are dust. Wonderful, wondrous, living dust, but dust. We are weak. We have banged ourselves up, and sometimes we continue to bang ourselves up. And if God threw a life away just because it was a little banged up or a whole lot banged up, there'd be none of us around. But God doesn't. He doesn't. He's got us on the road of rehabilitation, to restoration, to healing. He's healing that which is broken. And you know what? He is able to work with us because we are able to recognize we are not whole. Read with me, please, Matthew 9, verses 10 through 12. He's able to work with us because we are able to recognize we are not whole, that we need some restoring, that we need some rehabilitation. In Matthew 9, beginning in verse 10, verses 10 through 12, it says, "And it came to pass, as Jesus sat at meat in the house, behold, many publicans and sinners came." Now, there was no problem recognizing that, hey, they're not whole, they're broken, they're banged up. Oh, yeah, they need help. And they sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto his disciples, "Why does your master eat with publicans and sinners?" But when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, "They which be whole," and he could have worded it, "they who think they are whole, don't think they need a physician." He said, "They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick." We have recognized and acknowledged that we are broken and need healing. Now you think about it, the Pharisees did not see, did not acknowledge that they were broken in any way. Therefore, as a result, they could not be helped. They could neither be helped, nor could they be of any true help to anybody else. They could not be healed, and they could not help heal. You know, sometimes we speak of the healing of the nations, which we know is going to take place. And when we speak of healing, it goes beyond the physical. Any elder, any minister can tell you, and any one of you can say it, if you think about it, that when we talk about healing, it goes far beyond just the physical. It goes into the spirit of the mind, the emotions, the psyche. You know, some of the Pharisees may have been the picture of health. You may have looked at some of the Pharisees and they may have just glowed with perfect physical health. I'm sure some of them did. Some of them may have just been some of the best examples you could ever see of physical health. But there was a whole lot of breakage that did not show on the surface. And you know, the greatest breaches and breakages are starting to take just as much of the mind and the spirit as the physical, but frankly, I think they're greater. I know it's a whole lot harder to heal them. God could heal any physical ailment just like that, instantaneously. But those breaches and brokennesses of the mind, the spirit, it takes longer. Now we talk about the healing of the nations when Christ returns. That's going to be the time of the restoration of all things. And we know the scriptures that speak of that. Christ will heal the nations. And there are plenty of scriptures that will testify to that. But has that healing already started taking place in some important way, form, or fashion? And if it has, where and how so? You're ahead of me. I know that. And that's good. Because see, that healing, that rehabilitation, that restoring has already started with the first fruits, with you and me. It's already begun with us. We as the first fruits are the first ones to experience God's philosophy and practice of you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up or a whole lot banged up. We're the first recipients of His keeper attitude. We're the first beneficiaries of His committal mentality. And you know what? He is restoring us so that we can help restore others. He is healing us that we may help heal others. He is rehabilitating us so that we may help rehabilitate others. Jesus Christ has a number of titles. Some are very familiar to us. I think one that, or two I should say, that are very familiar to us is Jesus Christ is referred to as, quote, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. King of Kings, plural. Lord of Lords, plural. And it doesn't take much guesswork, does it, to figure out who those lesser lords, or those lesser kings are. We're very familiar with scriptures like Revelation 5:10. You don't need to turn there, but you recognize it, Revelation 5:10. And has made us into our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. We know that we are those lesser kings, those lesser lords that are going to rule with him. And if we're going to sit with Jesus Christ, as we are, doesn't it make sense? Isn't he concerned what kind of mindset is sitting beside him and helping to rule this planet in a future time? But I want to add a couple of other titles. I don't think you will find them listed this way in the Bible per se, but along the order of King of Kings and Lord of Lords, we know Christ as a healer. We know he's a redeemer. So we can say healer of healers. We can say redeemer of redeemers, because he's going to heal and he's going to redeem, and we're going to assist in that healing process and in that redeeming process. And I won't ask you to turn to Obadiah, because I could tell you what page it is in my Bible, but that wouldn't help you probably, as you got the same Bible. By the time you found it, would be moving on. But if you want to write it down, Obadiah 1, verse 21. You know, part of our job is going to be assisting in healing and redeeming. Obadiah 1, verse 21 makes this statement. It says, "And saviors," plural, "shall come upon Mount Zion to judge or rule the mount of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's." We're going to function in those roles. But even as Christ has and is working with us, so it is how he wants us now to learn how to work with each other and with others. Christ is healing us now that we may help heal others later. And it's not just for later. It's not just for later. It's obviously for now. That bottom line philosophy of you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. That philosophy is good for all time. The millennium, the last great day, needed then, absolutely needed now just as much. Such attitude that's taken on by the first fruits and exercised in this age is part of the preparation for being part of the coming kingdom of God in a very important way. You know, by the time Christ returns to this earth, by the time the millennium begins, can you imagine the shape that the remnants of the nations will be in? They will be shell-shocked. They will be in a state of shock. They will have gone through the Great Tribulation. I said remnants. Those are the ones who survive through that time. They're going to be totally banged up. They're going to need help from people who share a kinship with them, an identity with them, who have also been banged up to a degree, but who have been healed and can now help with their healing. And obviously, as I said, we don't have to wait till that time to begin to both see and practice in this age in regards to broken conditions and broken people. What's the story of mankind? Let's throw out a couple of verses that kind of notate the story of mankind in a sense. Proverbs 14:12. Remember what it says? It's important enough that God repeated it in chapter 16 and verse 25 of Proverbs. We recognize it there in Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that seems right to a man. How many times have we seen people do what they think is right, and if you follow them, you see all the wreckage in their wake, and you see them being broken as well as time goes along as they travel the way they travel. But the end thereof are the ways of death. That means a lot of breakage. That means a lot of banged up lives. And I always think of the words, when I think of Proverbs 14:12, I always think of the words of Jeremiah also, in Jeremiah 10, verse 23. You don't have to live very long that if you're observant to see the truth of these things, these statements. Jeremiah 10:23, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walks to direct his steps. You can express the Great Tribulation in you can use different words to describe it, express it different ways. But one way of describing it is that the Great Tribulation is simply the culmination. It's the coming to a head of all of what Proverbs 14:12 talks about, what Jeremiah 10:23 talks about, and other verses. The culmination of it all coming to a head because man doesn't know how to prevent breakage. The story of man is one of breakage, of broken people and broken things. Take Seabiscuit again. Take the name. It's C-S-E-A as in water. It's not sea biscuit as you see it and you eat it. I have a 30-year-old son. My youngest is 30. He's not able to be here this weekend. And at the feast in St. Petersburg in 1985, he was 3 years old. Little shaver, 3 years old. My wife and I left him and the other children with a babysitter between services on the Sabbath. And when we got back, of course, mothers are inquisitive, and she asked Lauren, all of 3 years old, Lauren, what did you eat? You know, she's just curious what he had for lunch. What did you eat? And he looked at her like, what do you mean? I ate what I saw. That was the way it was. What he saw, he ate. We should have named him Mikey. But for those that remember Mikey many years ago. But Seabiscuit, this is not your light, fluffy, tasty, hot biscuit on your mama's biscuit platter. This is a hard, tough biscuit of the sea. It was commonly called hardtack. And it was literally one tough cookie. You could eat it, but it wasn't very palatable. It was part of the seagoing rations. And it was made to last for weeks and months at a time. It had to. You know, they could be at sea for months at a time. Hardtack, Seabiscuits. So in reality, when you think about it, Seabiscuit carried the same name as his father, Hardtack. Seabiscuit and hardtack are synonyms. They mean the same thing. And how appropriately named, because his life became one big hardship of breakage. Now, Hardtack's father was man of war. The British man of war was a warship. The British men of war were warships. In their day, upon the tossing waves of the sea, they would come broadside to another ship and then try to blow it out of the water. And in our way of speaking, in our day and time, and into our vocabulary and communication has come phrases such as, wow, he got hit with a broadside. It goes back to those men of war. Or he got blown out of the water. It goes back to that time. Or, well, he's a loose cannon. The cannons were anchored with ropes and such. And sometimes in battle, one would get blown or torn loose, and it would roll all around inside that ship there and wreak tremendous damage before it could be secured again. The terms man of war, hardtack, Seabiscuit, those names conjured up tough, hard times, and how fitting, how appropriate. Man of war had inherited a certain flaw from his father, Fairplay, who had inherited from his father, Hastings. He was temperamentally uncontrollable. And he became a prolific sire, populating the racing world with beautiful man-eaters. A typical example was his son, War Relic, who, while just a youngster, stomped a groom to death. Fortunately, this particular flaw didn't pass on to Seabiscuit. He was different. But this flaw was so typical and fitting of the breakage in human affairs. What really made the difference with Seabiscuit were men who wouldn't give up. Men who wouldn't turn loose, men who wouldn't throw him away. Their philosophy wouldn't let them. They had a keeper, committal attitude. He's worth the effort. I believe in him. I'm going to stay with it. They were gentle. They were patient. They took time. And it was all founded upon that special mindset that you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. That's the approach God has with us. It's a healing, helping approach. I'd like for you to notice with me Isaiah 42 and verse 3. Isaiah 42 and verse 3. Have you ever thought about this verse and what it's really saying? A bruised reed. A bruised reed is a weakened reed. A bruised reed will break easier than a sound, healthy, unbruised reed. And a reed doesn't seem that very important anyway, does it? A bruised reed shall he not break. You can put more pressure on a totally healthy reed and not break it. You can put less pressure on a bruised reed and still break it. A bruised reed shall he not break. And the smoking flax, the old saying that where there's smoke, there's fire. The smoking flax, doesn't say it's a flaming flax, it says smoking. There's smoke rising, but the smoking flax shall he not quench. He shall bring forth judgment unto truth. He would see the bruise. He would notice the tiny flame that was there, the spark that was there. He would deal easy with a wounded situation. He wouldn't crush any spark that was there. He would deal in hope. He would exercise a healing touch. Now go forward to Luke 4 and verse 18. Luke 4 and verse 18. In light of that, Luke records this. The Spirit of the Lord, Christ said, is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel, the good news to the poor. Luke 4:18. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. And he wants you and me, us, whom he has dealt with in that way and continues to deal with in that way, to copy that and to learn to practice that. You know, on his way to Jerusalem, one of those famous stories in the Bible of where he was on his way to Jerusalem, and here he came with the disciples to this little village of the Samaritans. And because his mind was focused on Jerusalem, they could see that Christ is going there for the last time as a human being. He was going up there to die as a sacrifice. He was focused. They picked up on that, and they wanted him, just keep moving, keep moving. We don't want you here. Remember James and John? Lord, let's call down fire from heaven, burn them out. He turned and he told them. He said, you don't know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they just simply went on to another village. Christ could have looked at him and said, James, John, you sons of thunder, you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. You don't burn out a whole village just because there's some things that aren't quite what they should be. And Jesus Christ wants, again, you and me to copy his way. Notice Hebrews 12, verses 12 and 13. In Hebrews 12, Hebrews is the book written by, I don't think there's too much doubt that it was the Apostle Paul, but it's written roughly 3 decades or 30 years after the church was founded, specifically to the Jerusalem congregation with its sister congregations in Judea, a veteran church. The first congregation and her sister congregations. And Paul is instructing them. He says in Hebrews 12, verses 12 and 13, and of course the times they were currently living in with rebellion about to explode with the Jews against Rome. And of course in 70 AD, the ransacking, destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, they were in tough times. Notice what, and there were people who were going to have extra help. But notice the philosophy, the approach of what was admonished. Hebrews 12, verses 12 and 13. Wherefore, lift up the hands that hang down. You ever see somebody tired, dejected, discouraged? What happens, if you talk about reading body language, when somebody is discouraged, usually they're just sagging. Their shoulders are just sagging. Their hands are hanging down lower than usual because they're sagging with discouragement. You don't usually see a discouraged person with the shoulders squared off. They're sagging. talking about discouragement and helping people lift up the hands that hang down because people are depressed or discouraged. They need uplift. And the feeble knees. And there are situations and times where literally the knees are weakened. You ever seen people have to face something and all of a sudden they just sit down because they can't stand, their knees get weak? And make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. The whole concept, again, is not just for the world to come and dealing with people then. It's needed now in our time, in the congregations, in the church, in neighborhoods, with family, with friends. It needs to be practiced now, and in so doing, we're training for the kingdom and being beneficial in the meantime, and we're learning a healing way. It becomes our MO, and as it truly becomes part of our makeup, it's going to drive all of our functioning. And it is a powerful aspect of agape. Remember Barnabas? He functioned that way. In fact, that was one of the strongest parts of his makeup. He functioned that way so much so that his name, which was Joses, was changed in one sense, or let's say he was surnamed by the apostles. He was surnamed Barnabas, which means the son of consolation, or consoling, or in other words, the son of encouragement. We're familiar with that account. It was very fitting to his makeup, and that in his makeup paid off so richly in terms of healing and rehabilitation. Remember when Paul first came to Jerusalem as a converted individual and he wanted to join up with the brethren? They were afraid of him. Maybe this is a ruse. Maybe he just wants to find out who's with this cult the way he sees it. Maybe, is this sincere? I can understand it from the human standpoint. They kind of doubted the sincerity of the situation, but Barnabas took him. Who stood with him? Who took him? It was Barnabas. And he brought him to the apostles and he stood for him. And Barnabas was there with him when Paul really needed somebody to stand with him. You know, we won't turn to this, but in Acts 12, there's the account in Acts 12 where it tells how Barnabas and Paul left on a trip and they took John Mark with them. And then Acts 15 contains the account later on, at a later time, when Paul and Barnabas were going to take another trip. And you know what I'm referring to because, again, it's another one of those accounts that we're so familiar with. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them again, and Paul didn't. And, you know, probably in this life, we will probably never know fully why. You know, what the issue really was. We can guess that and we can speculate. But evidently something had happened at a previous time where John Mark had let them down. There was something that had happened that Paul didn't want to take a chance again, whatever. Maybe he had gone back on them, whatever. Whatever had happened, it was something negative in Paul's eyes. And there was a lot riding on the trip. There was always a lot riding on those trips. Whatever the reasons, Paul didn't want to take him, but Barnabas did. And they both felt very strongly about it, and the feelings were strong enough that they separated and each went their own way. They didn't all go off and start doing a different work. That wasn't what they did. One Paul went in and took the trip he was going to take. He took Silas with him. Barnabas just simply went in a different direction, and he took John Mark with him. Whatever the situation and the reasons, Barnabas stood by the son of consolation, the son of encouragement, stood by John Mark. Let me read you the words of Paul to Timothy at a later time, because this is interesting that years go by, and years later when Paul writes Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verses 9, 10, and 11. 2 Timothy 4, verses 9, 10, and 11. Here's what Paul says to Timothy. Do your diligence to come shortly to me. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark. That's John Mark. Take Mark and bring him with you, Timothy, because he, John Mark, whom I didn't want with me that other time, that second time, he is profitable. He is profitable to me for the ministry. He is profitable to me for the ministry. He panned out. Whatever his problems, whatever the breakage, it got healed. He came through. And we have to wonder how much of that was due to Barnabas. Barnabas wouldn't turn loose. He had a keeper attitude, a committal mentality. John Mark turned out to be very profitable to Paul. And brethren, he's turned out very profitable to God as an instrument, and very profitable to us, because when we read the book of Mark, we're reading what John Mark was inspired to write. If we truly want to be an effective instrument in God's hands later, then we must also now be allowing God to plant that deep operational concept in us that can best be described in those words: you don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up. That's absolutely needed as operational bedrock, because again, we're going to inherit an awfully banged up world. Just like us, God is calling banged up lives into His church who need help and support and rehabilitation and healing. The first fruits are being developed. They're being rehabilitated. And sometimes those God calls are very banged up. Remember the scripture? If you want to turn there with me, you can. I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11, it says this: "Know you not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Don't be deceived. Neither fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, effeminate," you talk about a list, "abusers of themselves with mankind, thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God." And rightly so. They shouldn't. And they won't. "And such were some of you." Just like in this room, there's some of us, every one of those categories, somebody in here can fit in one of those categories. But see, when he says, "and such were some of you," but you are washed, you are sanctified, you are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God, and such were some of you. That's always been the case, and even more so as society grows worse and God continues to call first fruits in this age. But there's been a healing, and there's a healing that continues to go on and take place. You know, whether we get banged around due to our own fault or not due to our own fault, you know what people need? They need somebody in their corner who will not give up on them, who will not quit on them, who won't turn them loose. People who believe that they are worthwhile, that they are worth fighting for, who believe in them. It's an aspect of agape that's a very powerful force. Be that for someone. When United began back in 1995, there was a lot of walking wounded. The apostasy had done a number on people. There was a lot of breakage. There were a lot of banged up people. We recognized that. We acknowledged that. We saw that. That was partly what we bore in mind when we established our attendance policy, that anyone is welcome to attend with us as long as they do it peacefully. We established that partly because of what we understood. And that's why we still have that policy, that anyone is welcome to attend with us as long as they do it peaceably. You know, as a pastor, working with people and using a scale of 1 to 10 to measure their receptivity to me working with them, I would like to have a 10 with them. But if all they give me is a 1, I will work with a 1 and hope that eventually it'll be a 2, and then a 3, and a 4, and move on up. Because they're still worth it. They're still worth it. Sometimes a hand that still reaches out makes all the difference. At what point do we give up on somebody? At what point should we give up? Is it when it looks hopeless? When, as far as we can judge, it is hopeless? On the morning of June 23rd, 1938, Red Pollard was helping a friend with a horse when he had a riding accident that almost sheared his leg off, his right leg off below the knee. Both bones of his lower lower leg was splintered. As summer turned into fall, Red was still in the hospital. He was not getting any better. The doctors had operated repeatedly on the crushed leg, re-breaking it, resetting it, but it would not heal. In mid-November, after 5 months in bed, Red finally got out of the hospital. But shortly thereafter, with a misstep, he re-broke that leg. A different doctor dealt with the leg. This time it held, but he was told he'd never ride again. A short time after this, in February 1939, Seabiscuit was entered in a race. In the race, he injured his left foreleg. A vet examined him. The injury was in the suspensory ligament. If it was ruptured, the horse's career was finished. The ligament was ruptured. Over the months that followed, Red and Seabiscuit limped over the ranch together. Red believed that both he and Seabiscuit would be back, and he was slowly but surely working toward that. He was planning a comeback. When word got outside the ranch, went beyond the ranch of what he was planning, it was outlandish. The comeback, if successful, would be unprecedented. No elite horse had ever returned to top form after such a serious injury and lengthy layoff. Few great horses have competed beyond age 5 or through more than 40 races. In a couple of months, Seabiscuit would be a bewhiskered 7 years old, more than twice the age of many of those he'd be racing against, and he'd already raced 85 times. But slowly and painfully, both began to heal. And there was something new that was very interesting. Seabiscuit was developing a new stride. No longer did he stab out with a foreleg as he ran, producing the curiously choppy duck-waddle gait that so many observers have mistaken for lameness. He now folded his legs up neatly under him when airborne, directing all of his motion forward and back, not side to side. It was a beautiful, smooth gait and probably a sounder one. And then on the morning of March the 2nd, 1940, the jockey who would never ride again climbed on the horse that would never race again. And together, they clocked a new track record that would stand untouched for a decade. 1 mile and 1/4 in 2 minutes, 1 1/5 seconds. In American history at the time, it was the second fastest 10 furlongs that had ever been run in American history. There was only one time that was in America that was faster for that length. And the Santa Anita Handicap put him over the top as the biggest money-making horse of the time. When do you give up on someone? It says even the righteous falls 7 times, but they get up. They can fall. But just because you see a person down doesn't mean they're going to stay down. And are you there to help them get back up? When is it time to give up on someone? In 1937, when thousands were crowded the rails to see Seabiscuit, my mother was standing on a stool crowding the counter, kitchen counter. She was 9 years old. The same year Seabiscuit came on the scene, the same year my grandmother left the scene. The years that Seabiscuit was healing, those same years my grandmother was breaking. In the year Seabiscuit found his mind, my grandmother lost hers. She became another victim of the breakage of this society. My mother, who was 9 years old, but the oldest child, had to take over all the housekeeping responsibilities and look after the younger siblings. My grandmother was, as they said in those days, crazy. She had lost her mind. We may never know fully why until the kingdom of God, but it was evidently a combination of things until something snapped. And you know, there were some who told my grandfather that he ought to put her away, divorce her. Jesse, she's crazy. My grandfather keeping my grandmother didn't make any sense to some, but it did to others. They would say, you know, Myrtle's crazy, and Jesse's crazy about Myrtle. He had a keeper mentality. He wouldn't turn loose. He was committed. He could have used those words. You don't throw a life away just because it's a little banged up, and hers was a whole lot banged up. Very early on, in the early years of her mental illness, my grandfather made a statement to his niece one day. That niece is still living. She's almost 90. He walked off down into the woods to have a private place she figured to pray. And when he came walking back up, and by the way, that grandfather of mine listened to Mr. Armstrong in the early 40s. When he walked back up out of the woods, he told her, he said, you know, he said, Myrtle is going to be healed. I don't know when, but someday God is going to heal her. I had never known her any different. And then one Sunday, when I was about 12 years old, after about 26 years of mental illness for her, my grandfather drove up in our yard. There was somebody in the car with him, and it was my grandmother. He had gone down to the state mental hospital to see her, and he brought her back with him. She rolled down the window. She talked with me, the rest of us, just as clearly as I'm talking with you now. She was healed. My grandfather died October 8th, 1997, at the age of 94. My grandmother died March 3rd, 2000, at the age of 97. They had 73 years of marriage together. God healed her, and I'll always believe that God honored them with long life together in great part because of my grandfather sticking by her and not giving up on her. I firmly believe that was one of the reasons. Think what would occur if we all had more of a keeper mentality. Think of how much more healing could take place if we wouldn't give up on someone so easily. Think what God could do with us and through us. When I read God's assurance in Hebrews 13:5, where he says, let your conduct be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he has said, I'll never leave you, nor forsake you. I will never leave you, nor forsake you. And when I read his reassurance in Philippians 1:6, being confident of this very thing, that he which has begun a good work in you will perform it, will finish it, the margin says, until the day of Jesus Christ. I find myself wanting to copy that in my dealings with others. And when I go to my knees in prayer and I say, thank you, Father, and Jesus Christ at the Father's right hand, thank you for your coming kingdom. Thank you for your calling and your training. Thank you for the incredible future ahead of me. And thank you for not throwing my life away because it was banged up.